I'd like to welcome everybody to Placing Short Fiction. I am the moderator, Ira Nayman, and I have several moderator things to say before we begin. I would like to mention that my pronouns are traditional male, he, him. I should start, as most panels do these days, with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that this panel is hosted on the traditional unceded territory of the people. I'm in northern Toronto, so that would be the Anishinaabe people. My apologies if I have mispronounced that in any way. If you have a question, please, if you have a question, you'll notice that next to the chat at the bottom of your screen, if you move your cursor, there is a Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, because if the chat gets going and there's a lot of people commenting there, we will lose the questions, and we don't want to do that. When I moderate panels, ordinarily the way I do it is we will talk amongst ourselves for roughly 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will open it up to questions. So feel free to write out a question in the Q&A at any time. If there's something, I believe that Nathan is monitoring the questions, and if there's something that, you know, just has to, that relates to something that one of us said and has to be asked at that point, I'm not, you know, I'm not a dictator about these things. We can open up to questions whenever there is one that's really relevant. But generally, I like to give the panelists a little time to talk before we open it up. And don't forget that, that there is a vendor's room, and most of the panelists are writers, and we would love for you to check out our books there. I will also, since I did ask permission and I'm okay, Nathan is okay with this, I'm also going to do a shameless plug. I am the editor of Amazing Stories magazine, and next weekend, Amazing Stories will be hosting AmazingCon. 50 of our contributors will be doing readings and on panels and all of the good stuff that happens at cons. But the reason I'm mentioning it specifically before this panel is that Douglas Smith, who is the author of Playing the Short Game, a really good book on selling short fiction, will be giving a workshop on selling short fiction. I assume that a lot of you who are here are writers who want to sell your short fiction. So if you want more information on that, yeah, please check out AmazingCon, and particularly Douglas's workshops. Okay, all that out of the way, I usually start by having the panelists introduce themselves. So Laurence, if you'd like to start, tell us who you are.
Sure, my name is Laurence Brothers. I'm a writer and a technologist. I've got a background in AI and internet R&D. I started writing seriously in 2015, and since then I've sold a little over 30 short stories. I also have a novel, World War I fantasy novel, Twilight Patrol, and a urban fantasy novella, The Demons of Wall Street, that just came out, which I'm proud of, from another Canadian small press, Mirror World. And that's it for me. Oh, pronouns are he and him.
Okay, I'm Brian Mcnett. I'm a writer and anthologist living in Bremerton, Washington. I've actually recently returned to writing after a 20-year hiatus in which I spent living as a character in a William Gibson Sprawl novel, complete with a large Japanese megacorporation as my employer. I have experience in network security for said large Japanese megacorporation, and a background in technology and electronics, as well as writing.
Okay, and I guess the first question, like a good place to start would be, when you're editing an anthology, what are you looking for, and what? Okay, so two-part question: what are you looking for, and then what are you not looking for? What are you looking to just get rid of immediately.
Shall I start with that one?
Yes, Brian.
Okay. When I'm doing an anthology, well, basically I'm looking for short fiction. I'm not looking for novellas or novelettes. I like to have, when I do an anthology, clear published guidelines. And I will say, okay, I want a story of, say, 4,800 words or less. And when, well, a really good example would be my most recent efforts with Jennifer Lee Ross. I actually have a short plug for space opera libretti. Oh, that doesn't quite come up on the background. Anyway, this was a sort of a twist on space opera, actual opera in space. We wanted humorous, light, fun stories. And of course, when I put humorous, light, fun stories in the background, this immediately rules out a whole lot of fiction. And humor is difficult to write. And so really, you're putting a challenge before the average writer when you say, hey, I want something funny. And I tend to go toward light stories rather than, you know, really heavy, serious, dark fiction. So as an editor, I just sort of gravitate that direction.
I actually, I was so interested in jumping in to get the questions going that I didn't introduce myself, actually. I'm a humorous science fiction writer who just happens to also edit Amazing Stories magazine, but
Yeah.
the writing is my first love, and it's much more of a through line than editing is for my, you know, sort of life story. And to some extent, now to answer my question, unless you have something more you want to say, because I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. When we started sitting around and just kind of chatting about the kind of magazine that we wanted to produce, Steve Davidson, Kermit Woodall, Steve is the publisher, Kermit is the art director, and myself sat down and took a look at kind of the landscape of science fiction, where science fiction was at the moment. And one of the things that we very quickly realized was that it was a lot darker than the science fiction that we had grown up with. Most of us were, you know, children of the 60s and 70s. We grew up with original Star Trek, where, you know, science fiction was an adventure for sure, but it was a fun adventure. And we looked around and it was all dystopian this and post-apocalyptic that, and it was just very dark. And so one of the things that was very important to us, and it's kind of following along what Brian said, is that we were very keen on more positive science fiction. In the last few months, the term I've come across again and again for this is hope punk, which is a strange word. I'm not sure, even now, I'm not sure I like it. But it does kind of get to that feeling of a more positive kind of science fiction. I should say, now when I say that, let us take for granted that at its very sort of base core level, we all editors, all publishers, everybody who's looking for material wants well-written stories, right? Well-written stories are the minimum that just kind of get you attention and get you through the door, right? Then on top of that, we're all looking for very specific sort of niches of stuff. I'd like to throw this open to you, Laurence. From the other side, when you are looking for a market for a story, how do you decide which publication to submit to?
There's a lot of factors, and in fact, by a strange coincidence, I have a submission right now to the SFWA blog about how to do this. There's a whole bunch of factors, and they vary depending on time of day, phase of moon, and things like that. But I think that most people can probably prioritize at least a few of them. So, for example, there's pay rate. If you're looking to become a member of Science Fiction Writers of America, SFWA, then their presence on the qualifying list of publications for membership is a factor. More important for me is response time. If somebody like Clark's World is going to respond in 2 days with a rejection, I'd much rather have that than wait a year for somebody else. Then there's the acceptance rate for the magazine itself. Clark's World is probably 0.1% or less acceptance from slush. Whereas an incredibly prestigious magazine like Nature, which, tens of thousands of scientists and postdoc researchers would sell their souls to publish in, has almost a 10% acceptance rate for science fiction stories. So, that's a consideration for submission. But there's a number of other things. There's the prestige of the magazine, which is related to the pay level, but not the same. So, for example, Interzone only pays a penny a word, but they're a famous magazine. Some magazines make a policy of providing useful personal rejections, which is always nice, especially if you're starting out. There's a question of the readership of the magazine. How many people are going to see your story? So if somebody could pay you a quarter a word, and that's nice, it's almost, half of what you could starve on as a short story writer. But, if nobody's going to read it, it's kind of bittersweet pay. There's, of course, the fit for the story. You don't want to sell a fantasy story, try to sell a fantasy story to Analog or a hard-boiled story to the New Yorker or any other kind of total clash. But I should say, fit is not necessarily the be-all and end-all, because there are a lot of magazines which will be happy to publish something that just happens to catch the editor's attention, which is, an exceptional story. There's politics in the personality of the editor. Politics is a serious consideration. If you don't want to be associated with a magazine which is grotesquely inappropriate as regards your personal views. And then, of course, finally, there's submission fee, which for genre magazines is usually zero. But for literary journals, you really have to question whether it's worth it to put your hat in the ring for essentially what's a lottery ticket. There's plenty of great journals in literary and general fiction which pay well and have no fees, so you might consider those as priorities. Lots of other factors and considerations, really. You can go on and on, because rejectomancy is a time-honored writing tradition, but I think I'll end it there. Thanks.
Okay. You mentioned how many stories you had published. How many stories have you had rejected?
All of them. Well, actually, one of them, of all the stories I published, one was published on the first submission. On average, I have about 5 submissions before acceptance, 5 to 10, perhaps, to be honest. My longest lived story had 30 submissions before acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've heard that you can't really consider yourself a writer until you've had at least 100 rejections. By that count, I figure I'm a writer at least 3 times over and working steadily towards my 4th time, right?
Yeah.
That is something that every writer has to come to terms with, right? You have to grow a thick skin. You have to learn how to deal with rejection. And speaking of rejection, so Brian, what's the quickest way to get a story rejected by you?
The quickest way to get a story rejected by me is to not have read the submission guidelines. When I ask for stories of 4,800 words or less, and you send me a 1,600-word story, it's likely not to even get past the slush pile. When I ask for when I ask for humorous fiction and you send me a dystopia, same thing. Uh, uh, in addition to having the editing background, I've also been a slush pile reader. So I've done a lot of slush pile reads. So that's one of those things where you get to know when a story is gelling or not. And one of the first things to go through is, okay, how well did they read the guidelines? That will get me. If they fail to read the submission guidelines, it will show in their submission, and that's the first thing.
Let me give the people who are here, the people in attendance, some idea of just how intense that process is. In the first year that we opened submissions for Amazing Stories, we had 2,000 submissions, roughly 2,000 submissions, and I could accept 40 stories. That means that only 1 in 50 stories roughly were accepted, or to put it a different way, 49 out of 50 stories were rejected. Okay, and so you have to think for the readers who are going through all of this stuff, and I advise them this when I take them on, as soon as they realize the story is not going to work for us, reject it. Do not spend your time reading a story all the way through if it's clear fairly early on that we're not going to accept it, right? And so as Brian says, because this I totally agree with, we have a policy at Amazing Stories that the slush readers, the first readers of the story, read blind, which means that the story has to have no identifying information on it whatsoever. And so much of the time, it gets rejected before it even gets read, because we know that the first page has the author's name and contact information. Right? Now, here's the thing, and Laurence, I'm going to ask you if you do this. Because I also write, and because I've also submit a lot of stories to magazines, one of the things I do is, as soon as I find out what their guidelines say they want, I will reformat stories. I've had to reformat stories 6 or 7 times sometimes, so that that conforms with the guidelines of the magazine that I'm trying to sell it to. And a lot of writers will just format it once and send it out, which obviously is an open invitation for rejection. Laurence, do you do a lot of reformat?
Not a lot, because most of the magazines I submit to share the common modified SMF, which is Times Roman, double-spaced, full paragraphs, italics and boldface instead of marks, and a few other forms that are consistent in most guidelines. If a guideline does specify something else like courier or single space leading or whatever, of course I will reformat it. It's a little bit silly to me in some respects, because of course hitting Control A and then clicking the font button or whatever is only about 3 or 4 seconds, and I would expect that the editor could take those 3 or 4 seconds just as well without, great deal of rancor from the editor. But why not? It says so in the guidelines. Why not, conform to them if it, prioritizes the story a little bit? Why not?
Well, to point it out from the other side, though, what you're doing when you're submitting a story to a publication is you're really trying to set up a relationship with the editor, right? And if you do not follow the guidelines that the editor has set for the publication, you're telling the editor in a very subtle way, but you are sort of saying, I'm not going to work that well with you, right?
Yes.
So on a practical...
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're muted now, but I'll stop on you anyway. I completely agree that you should do your best to conform to the editor's wishes, because they're the ones making the decision about the story. Some types of guidelines seem to be a lot more important than others, like an anonymous manuscript If you screw that up, they're just going to toss it away regardless. Whereas conceivably, 14 points versus 12 might just slide by. Anyway.
One of the things that I try and tell people and try and instill in writers is that you may think that the job is to get the editor to say yes to your story, but actually your first job is to make sure the editor doesn't say no, right? And the best way to get them to say no is to not follow what they ask for. Brian, I have a question for you that that always perplexes me. How do you feel about rejecting stories that you like?
Oh, it's hard. There've been quite a few stories that I've liked over the years, which you say, oh, this is good, but it's not a fit for what I'm doing at the moment. I suspect if I were doing a periodical rather than being an anthologist, where we have a set theme, I'd be doing fewer of those. But when you're doing an anthology and you have a theme and you have to stick to your theme and you get a good story and it's just not on theme, it's so painful.
Do you write encouraging responses when you have to reject a story you like?
Yes, I do try to write because I don't have, like I said, I'm not doing periodical publication, and I usually only do maybe 1 or 2 anthologies a year. And this year's anthology I've actually put off due to circumstances. I generally have a smaller pool of submissions. I've never had to deal with like 2,000 submissions for an anthology. A couple hundred is big. Yeah, I can do more personalized rejections on those stories that were really good and offer encouragement. Yeah, basically that would be my response, is to give an encouraging rejection.
Okay, yeah, that is by far the most difficult part of the job that I wasn't expecting, having to reject stories that I loved, but for one reason or another didn't work. And this is something that, again, we talked a bit earlier about how you as a writer deal with rejection. Understand that this is almost never personal, right? I mean, if the editor sends you an email saying, I hate your guts and don't ever send anything to me again, okay, that's personal. But most of the time, it's not. And especially, so we have a 2-step process where the slush readers will put something into editorial review, and then that's basically sending it up to me. But the authors, I believe, usually get a notice that it's been sent up to editorial review. It's made the first cut. I can accept maybe a third of those. So already, once it's got up to editorial review, somebody has really liked it, right? And I'll admit, and I knew this as a writer, but I didn't really get it in my kishkas until I became an editor. I've had to reject stories that I really loved because the issue before, I had a story that was too similar, right? Or that the voice just didn't quite work, or that I didn't have enough room in that particular issue for a story that length, right? There are a lot of reasons why stories get rejected that have nothing to do with the quality of the story. I notice that Laurence has talked about how many rejections he's gotten from amazing stories, and 3 of the stories were sold on to other publications. And I'm the first person to be happy for him that he sold those other stories, right? The thing is, and Brian, I'm going to get to this, and actually both of you could answer it, but I'll ask Brian first. The thing is, from my perspective, editors are not writers' enemies. Okay, we want all our writers to succeed. Okay, we want writers to do well too. the nachas, the happiness I get from reading a story that is just so spot on perfect, you know, there's very little joy to compare to it. Brian, and then Laurence, but I'll start with Brian. What do you think is the ideal relationship between an editor and an author?
Oh my. The ideal relationship between an editor and an author is a business partnership. Writers are in the business of writing stories. Editors are in the business of preparing stories for publication. That is basically a partnership. The end goal is to get the story into print. And so, yeah, every editor in the business is your best friend.
Laurence, I see you nodding. Do you agree?
Oh yeah. There may be one or two who are not my best friends, but you know, from a writer's point of view, a professional relationship, a professional partnership is ideal. But really, emotionally speaking, what we want is a loving parent. You know, we want anything we send to be not only paid for with an instant acceptance, but also to be posted on the refrigerator door. You know, and if in some horrible circumstances is actually rejected, then it should be a friendly, loving, rejection. So, but Brian is completely correct. I mean, if you can achieve mere recognition of your name and your work amongst a few editors, you really have it made, because now you have a channel for publishing stories. Not necessarily every time, not maybe even only occasionally, but it's both professional validation and it's a way to get your stories read.
Which reminds me of, again, another one of my pet peeves, and in like 2,000 rejections, this has only happened once, but I don't understand it. If you get rejected, don't write back to the editor what a fool he is for not accepting your brilliant story. Okay, because it's about relationships. It really is. And if that story didn't work, you know what? Your next one might have worked. But if you piss off the editor, if you just, just burn that bridge down, you are not going to be able to sell them anything. And you have to sort of see it in the long term, right? Someday down the road, even if you don't have anything in your inventory right now, somewhere down the road, you might write a story that's perfect for that publication. And if the editor blackballs you, if they don't want to work with you, you've screwed yourself. So always, always, always be professional. I see that we're about halfway through, so I'm going to ask Nathan if we have any questions that came from the audience, and to encourage people to submit questions to the Q&A. Nathan?
Of course, this is a time where my computer freezes. All right, we have quite a few really interesting questions. So, as an own voice writer / editor, I've had pushback with stories that are own voices with some rather harsh, ableist, anti-queer, trans comments. For marginalized writers, how does one break through into the anthologies and publications that will actually pay reasonably well?
Brian, do you want to take that?
Tough question, for sure.
I can take that. Do your research. Research the publications. One of the other policies that we have at Amazing Stories is that we want diversity. We have published some stories with differently abled main characters. We've published some queer stories. We're always looking for voices that aren't in the mainstream, right? There are publications like that. There are anthologies like that. There are specifically queer-themed anthologies, for instance, and also differently abled themed anthologies. So for me, it's just a matter of doing your research, finding them, If you don't know about Duotrope and the other, there are websites that have lists of what publications are out there and what they're looking for. If you're serious about it, that's what you should be doing. That's what you should be looking for. Do your research. Brian or Laurence, other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there's a real problem with figuring out whether a publication is legitimately concerned or interested in publishing marginalized writers with, or whether they're just paying lip service. And when you get that rejection with, with language which is bigoted or insensitive or just shows a lack of, education and self-awareness, I mean, you just have to mark them off, Personally, because of my personal privilege, I don't encounter a lot of abrasive responses from editors that annoy me, but I can see other people getting them. And when I do see other people getting them, that disinclines me to work with that particular editor or that particular magazine in the future. It's a serious problem. It's getting slightly better. SFWA, the science fiction writers, have just released, a major announcement with serious work associated with their words to help marginalized writers and people who are having difficulty because of exclusion in getting published. But it's going to be a struggle, and it's going to be a continuing struggle.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on something that you just spurred in me, just a thought that you spurred in me, read the magazine, right? Read other things that the editor of the anthology has published, because it's easy enough to say, but it's different actually trying to live that. But you will see very quickly from what the editor has done in the past, whether they're walking their walk or not. Brian, did you have anything to add?
No, you just covered it, actually.
Okay, fair enough. I promise you next time I won't talk and you can answer. Nathan, more questions?
A much simpler question this time. How do you feel about simultaneous submissions?
Brian?
As a writer, it's something I don't do. Many publications will have in their guidelines that they don't take simultaneous submissions. As Laurence said almost at the outset of this, he tends to submit to the outlets that reject the fastest, that give him the fastest turnaround time, so that his stories aren't sitting for a year at a publication waiting to be accepted or rejected. And I generally follow the same guideline when submitting stories for publication. I look at the rejection rates. I go on the submission grinder at Diabolical Plots, and I look at how fast are they rejecting or accepting stories. And that is something I factor in when I'm making submissions. I don't like having a lot of stories just sitting around at publishers waiting. Of course, this ups the number of rejections you get immensely. But this is good. This is a good thing. As an editor, I like to do the turnarounds as fast as I possibly can, because I understand that the writers need to have those stories available to send out to other publishers. So really, simultaneous submissions is, generally speaking, not something that I've seen publishers accepting. As a writer, it's something I don't do. As an editor, it's something I don't do.
Right.
Well, let me give a slightly different opinion. There are some magazines that like them and some don't. If you want to play efficient submission Tetris, as the term goes, you have to juggle these different requirements. I mean, they're in the guidelines. As it happens, literary journals and general fiction magazines tend to be more accepting of sim subs than genre magazines, but there are genre magazines that take them. So if they do, it's a bit unethical to submit to one that takes them and one that doesn't, because you're violating one of their guidelines. But when a story comes free and you can send it anywhere, and there are 3 magazines that seem appropriate, and you're willing to not submit to any no SimSub magazines for a while, then you can send it out to all of them. Just like you can query a whole bunch of agents at the same time for a novel. You know, some of them request notification of simultaneous submission. You do have to do that, you know, if you care about that editorial relationship. But as long as there's a dozen magazines, let's say mostly literary journals, that can take your story and will consider them at once over that same semester time they tend to take, you know, for responses, why not send it out to all of them? And then if you get an acceptance, you can politely inform the others of the rejection. What I believe editors really hate is thinking that they have a great story that they want to accept and then discovering it's already been sold. You know, that's got to end the professional relationship with, you know, prejudice. So if you don't want to piss off an editor, don't do that to them.
So here's a paradox, right? Stories that we reject, we're now down to about 2 weeks. If we don't want your story, you're going to hear about it fairly quickly. Stories that get to me and I actually like, that's going to take a lot longer. As long as you're still in the running, and as long as we may have a place for you, that's going to happen. So it's very much a no news is good news situation with us. And I'm mindful of that because, of course, as a writer, I want to know as quickly as possible what's going to happen to my story. So I try and be mindful of that, but we have, at Amazing Stories, we just have certain publishing realities that don't allow me to accept stories as quickly as I would like. Nathan, more?
Yes, actually, more about contests where you have to pay a fee and or get a subscription. Do you think it's a really good way to get published? How do you feel about them?
Every writer has to draw the line wherever they're comfortable drawing it. I don't generally submit prose fiction to contests. On the other hand, I've been doing a lot of submitting screenplays to screenplay writing contests. I'm just weird that way. Laurence, Brian, do either of you want to jump in on this?
Well, sure. The way I think about it is, first of all, there's a traditional sense in genre publishing that, and in professional publishing in general, that money should flow to the writer. So even a small fee irritates me, despite the fact it may be the fee that's required to pay for the operation of the magazine or something. But if it's for a contest, it's even worse because almost all feed contests are attempts to make money for the contest organizer. Now, if they're a charity and it's for a good cause, it's effectively a donation, so that's fine. But for other types of contests, the way I think about it is a magazine might be publishing 4 or even 10 or 12 stories in an issue. They have a lot of slots to fill. A contest has 1 or maybe 3, you know, if there's honorable mentions, slots, and they're probably taking those stories over the course of a year. And if you're going to pay even $3, much less 20 or 50, you know, this is a lottery ticket and it's not a good bet. You know, you might as well play Forex or go to the casino or something, or just pay for vanity publishing as far as I'm concerned. Now, there are some legitimate, really high-paying contests with no fees. And so what's wrong with submitting there as long as it's not locking out a story from publication in a magazine, you know? If SimSubs are accepted or you don't mind waiting the year for the contest to come back, well, sure, why not? It's not the most efficient way to be published compared to magazines as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Douglas Smith actually makes a really good argument in playing the short game. He says that what you want to do, and Laurence alluded to this earlier, so what you want to do is develop a list of magazines that you think might at least be interested in your story, and then categorize them from the ones you want to get to right away to the ones that that you don't. So for instance, if becoming a SIFWA member is important to you, then you'll do all the SIFWA qualifying publications at the top. And the less money will get lower down on your list. And then go through the list. Start from the top. A lot of writers think, oh, I'm going to start with a middle magazine and then work my way up. Why? What's the point? You might as well start from the top, because you never know. You might get to the accepted by the top. We have accepted at Amazing Stories, I think at least 2 or 3 stories that were the first publications of the authors. You never know. But if you actually start in the middle of your list, then you have been the one who has made sure that you're not going to get published at the top, right? And so another consideration might be contests. Start with the publications. If you don't get in the publication, try a contest, right? It could be in the middle or at the bottom of your list rather than the first place you go to. Brian, do you have any additional thoughts on that question? Oh, unmute.
There we go. Laurence was really comprehensive in his answer. There isn't a whole lot I can add to that. I'm not personally a fan of contests in general, and specifically contests that charge fees, and that goes back to what Laurence said about money should flow to the writer. Is really, money should flow to the writer. If the money isn't flowing to the writer, something is off. Yeah, contests, it's a crapshoot. If you win, you get a prize. If you don't win, your story doesn't see the light of day. But if you're submitting to any other publication, your risks are the same, that you'll be rejected, that your story won't be published, that you won't get paid. So if you're paying out money to participate in a contest in which you may not win, like I said, it violates that sense of the writer should be paid.
Or at the very least, be sure that that's what you want to do. I have a series of self-published books, and the first 2 books in the series were published with publishing companies. I put up $1,000 and they did all of the production. Then I found CreateSpace and Smashwords and realized I don't have to pay that money. I can do this all myself. So I moved on. It was part of, I guess, my learning curve as a self-published writer. I don't regret it. I don't necessarily advise it either, right? But in terms of, the overall arc of both your artistic career and your life, there might be reasons, might be good reasons why you would want to put up that money. But do it with eyes open is all I would recommend. Didn't mean to do that. We have less than 10 minutes left, actually closer to 5. So if you have any questions, get them in now. Nathan, any more questions you want to share?
Yes. How do you strategize your submissions Tetris when many magazines have very limited submissions windows, few times a year, or who don't advertise their submission windows very far in advance?
As a writer, Laurence, you're probably the most experienced with this.
Yeah, so certain magazines which are both high prestige, respectable pay, and irregularly open. So for example, Lightspeed is an example in the science fiction community. They used to fairly reliably have a window every year. It's unclear whether they're ever going to have another open slush window. They might, and I consider those to be kind of happenstance. I can't plan for them. Their acceptance rates are really low. So if I'm reserving a story for 6 months because I'm worried about it being held somewhere else, and I really want to send it to Lightspeed, Lightspeed's just going to reject it anyway. Odds are, let's say, so it just doesn't pay all that much. That said, if somebody tells me Lightspeed is going to be open, August 1st to August 15th, you know, I might well choose not to submit something in July if I think I have a decent shot there. You know, so it's a balancing act. But generally speaking, if a window opens, I'll see what I have, as opposed to writing for the window. Now, there's slightly different for themed anthologies, you know, because sometimes you might well write a story specifically for an anthology when you learn about it. I tend not to do that myself anyway, but a lot of other people do. So.
Earlier, I talked about inventory. It's a really good idea to write as many short stories as you can and constantly have them in circulation, but also have just a bunch that that aren't necessarily out or that you expect will come back quickly. And that, to my way of thinking, is probably the best way to capitalize on short windows that you don't get a lot of warning for. Brian, unless you have something to add, I think we can go to another question.
All right,
Okay.
there are lots of questions. I'm going to try to pick one. Let's see. When you see that a story is getting repeatedly rejected, when and how do you decide to rewrite versus continue to submit as is?
Laurence?
Yeah, well, everybody is different in this regard. My personal approach is usually I look the story over again. I mean, if it was a personal rejection and I agree with a comment, you know, then I have to make and it's a substantial revision, which is suggested by the comment, then it's a hard choice because I hate structural revision. Everyone hates structural revision, right? You know, the rewriting from 3,000 to 1,000 words or going the other way around or changing a whole plot line or something like that. It's traumatic and you think to yourself, maybe I should just write another story. But if somebody says, you know, I didn't understand this character's motivation, you know, I love this, that, and the other thing, I didn't understand his motivation. Well, maybe I'll take a look at it and, you know, try to nail it down a little more firmly for the reader's attention. It's not going to be all that much work. And moreover, even with a form, I'm often going to look through the story because these mot juste type revisions, little sentence changes, I just can't help doing that. It may not be highly efficient, you know, it may not be the Heinlein way, but I do that anyway. So I do small revisions over time, and it may well be that by the time the story gets accepted, it's had enough little revisions that it's substantially different.
Well, I think of it as a rolling edit. So every time that I'm going back into the story to change something specific, I'll often change a whole bunch of stuff around it. Because no story, what do they say? No story is ever finished. It's just kind of let go. And sometimes you get the chance to let it go several times. I would like to remind people we have literally 2 minutes left. I would like to remind people that there is an area in the Discord discussion place where you can ask the questions if they didn't get asked here. And I certainly will check it out. Hopefully Laurence and Brian will check it out too. Actually, I realize now that since we only have 2 minutes left, I'm going to cut off the questions and ask Laurence and Brian if they have any last words that they want to end the panel on. Let's start with Brian. You haven't said anything in a while.
Yeah, last thoughts. If you're writing stories, if you're submitting to short fiction markets, keep submitting. Don't give up. There's no shame in taking a story that's been rejected and setting it aside. And saying, okay, I'm going to let this sit for a while and maybe come back to it at some future date. And you may see through, this would be a completely different panel, reading your rejections and practicing some rejectomancy on the story, figuring out with a clear head what needs to happen to that story to make it more acceptable to the markets that are out there. But the main thing is keep at it.
Sorry, Laurence?
Yep, 100%. Writing is a craft. There are a few people who are flukishly talented and lucky and can sell their first novel as a classic. You know, there was competition from all the publishing houses, and and everything else is a golden path for them leading forward. But 99.99% of people aren't that way. Every word you write, is going towards the improvement of your skills. The honing of your critical ability, your ability to revise improves over time as you read and write. So you just have to keep at it if you want to be successful. I know there's a terrible burden, especially if you're committed to long form writing as opposed to short stories, to get over the hump of a first novel, because it feels like such an enormous emotional investment. And then maybe because of its raw edges or other little craft issues, it isn't quite sellable in the current form, and then it's very depressing. That's the advantage of short fiction as an entree to longer forms, is you can get all these rejections, you can inure yourself and harden yourself to the emotional blow, which can really be substantial when you love a story and the perfect market for it rejects it because they got a similar one the other day, and otherwise they would have published it, or something like that. There's nothing you can do but just keep going and improve over time. I don't think that professional level writing is magical or requires that unique talent. I think it's something that virtually anyone can do with commitment and enough words put in.
Okay. My final word is something that I used to tell my students when I was a teacher at Ryerson. Writing is kind of a thankless task. You can go 30 or 40 years without tremendous recognition, and frankly, 30 or 40 years without making a whole hell of a lot of money off of it. If you're going into writing for fame or fortune, you're going in the wrong reason. The only reason anybody should be a writer is because they love to write. It is a passion that they cannot see living their lives without. And the fun thing, the great thing about that is that you may go 30 or 40 years and never get recognition, but you've just spent 30 or 40 years of your life doing something that you love. And honestly, not a lot of people in this world can say that. I'd like to thank my panelists, Laurence and Brian. I'd like to thank Nathan for putting this together. This was awesome. I would like to thank all of you who attended our panel. I hope you found something useful in it, and I've got another couple of panels this weekend, so I hope you'll check that out. Check out my books in the vendor's room, and I'm going to shut up now. We're out of time. Goodbye.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
Thanks for moderating, Ira. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a good night.